Teenager films. Himself. Mocking veteran. What happens next goes viral. The warm summer breeze swept through Oak Ridge Park, carrying with it the faint scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. It was a typical Wednesday afternoon in the suburban town of Millbrook, where the lazy hum of distant lawnmowers mingled with the cheerful chirping of birds. At the heart of this idyllic scene, a group of teenagers lounged on the worn wooden benches near the park's central fountain, their attention fixed on the glowing screens of their smartphones. Among them sat Jake Thompson, a lanky 16-year-old with a mop of unruly brown hair and a perpetual smirk on his face. Known for his quick wit and penchant for stirring up trouble, Jake was the unofficial leader of this small clique. His fingers danced across his phone's screen as he scrolled through his social media feed, his eyes darting back and forth. Hungry for the next morsel of online drama or entertainment? God, I'm so bored, Jake groaned, tossing his head back dramatically. Nothing ever happens in this stupid town. His friends murmured in agreement, their own faces mirroring the same look of adolescent ennui. Sarah, a petite girl with fiery red hair, suggested half-heartedly, "We could go to the mall." Jake scoffed. "And do what? Window shop for things we can't afford? No thanks." As the group fell back into their collective trance, each lost in their own digital world, Jake's restless gaze wandered across the park. That's when he spotted him, an elderly man sitting alone on a bench at the far end of the park, near the duck pond. The man, unaware of the teenagers' scrutiny, sat with a quiet dignity. His weathered hands carefully tore pieces of bread, tossing them to the eager ducks that had gathered at his feet. He wore a faded plaid shirt tucked into well-worn khakis, and atop his head sat a navy blue cap adorned with a military insignia that Jake couldn't quite make out from this distance. This was Mr. Robert Mason, though Jake didn't know his name. At 78 years old, Mr. Mason was a fixture in Millbrook, a quiet presence that many of the town's younger residents barely noticed. His trips to the park were a daily ritual, a chance to enjoy the simple pleasure of feeding the ducks and basking in the peacefulness of nature. As Jake watched the old man, a mischievous idea began to form in his mind. His lips curled into a sly grin as he turned to his friends, his eyes glinting with excitement. "Hey, guys," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Watch this. I'm about to get us a viral video." Sarah looked up from her phone, her brow furrowed. "What are you talking about? Jake?" Jake nodded towards Mr. Mason. "See that old timer over there? I bet we could have some fun with him." The other teens followed Jake's gaze, a mix of curiosity and apprehension on their faces. "I don't know, Jake," mumbled Tom, a stocky boy with a kind face. "Maybe we should just leave him alone." But Jake was already standing up, his phone in hand, ready to record. "Don't be such a buzzkill, Tom. It's just a harmless prank. People love this stuff online." With that, Jake sauntered towards Mr. Mason, his friends trailing behind him with a mixture of excitement and unease. As they approached, Mr. Mason looked up, offering a gentle smile to the group of teenagers. "Afternoon," he said, his voice warm and gravelly. Jake, however, had no interest in pleasantries. He held up his phone, the camera pointed directly at Mr. Mason, and began his performance. "Well, well, well," Jake drawled, his voice dripping with mock surprise. "What do we have here? Looks like we've stumbled upon a real-life fossil." Mr. Mason's smile faltered, confusion and hurt flickering across his weathered features. Jake, emboldened by the nervous laughter of his friends, pressed on. "Hey, Gramps, did you get lost on your way to the retirement home? Or are you just here to bore the ducks to death with stories about the good old days?" The old man's shoulders slumped slightly, but he remained silent, his eyes now fixed on the bread in his hands. Jake, mistaking this silence for an invitation to continue, ramped up his taunts. "Nice hat, by the way. What's with the fancy pin? Let me guess. You won it in a bingo tournament at the senior center." At this, Mr. Mason's hand instinctively reached up to touch the military insignia on his cap. His eyes, filled with a mixture of sadness and quiet dignity, met Jake's for a brief moment before looking away. Jake's friends shifted uncomfortably behind him, the fun of the moment quickly evaporating. Sarah tugged at Jake's sleeve, whispering, "Come on, Jake, that's enough." But Jake was too caught up in his performance to stop now. He circled Mr. Mason, his phone capturing every angle of the old man's discomfort. What's the matter, old-timer? Cat got your tongue? Or did you forget how to talk? I hear that happens when you get to be about 100 years old." Throughout Jake's tirade, Mr. Mason remained silent, his face a mask of calm that belied the pain in his eyes. He had faced far worse in his life than the taunts of an ignorant teenager, but that didn't make the words sting any less. As Jake finally ran out of insults, an uncomfortable silence fell over the group. The only sounds were the quacking of the ducks and the distant laughter of children on the playground. "Whatever," Jake muttered, lowering his phone. "Let's go, guys. This geezer's no fun anyway." As the teenagers walked away, Jake already busy editing the video on his phone, Mr. Mason watched them go. He sighed deeply, tossing the last of his bread to the ducks before slowly rising from the bench. The encounter had lasted only a few minutes, but its impact would ripple out far beyond that moment in the park. As Mr. Mason made his way home, his steps a little heavier than usual, he couldn't help but wonder about the young man who had felt the need to mock him. What drove someone so young to be so cruel? Little did either of them know, this brief interaction was just the beginning of a story that would touch the lives of many and teach valuable lessons about respect, forgiveness, and the unexpected connections that can form between the most unlikely of people. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jake Thompson sprawled across his bed, phone in hand. His fingers moved swiftly across the screen, adding flashy effects and a thumping soundtrack to the video he'd captured earlier that day. A smug grin played on his lips as he imagined the likes and comments that would soon be flooding his social media accounts. "This is going to be epic," he muttered to himself, hitting the post button with a flourish. The caption read, "Found this relic in the park today. Watch me school this old-timer. Prank gone wild. Old people are funny." For the first hour, the video performed as Jake had expected. His usual crowd of followers chimed in with laughing emojis and comments like "savage," "bro," and "OMG." His face, though, Jake basked in the attention, refreshing the page every few minutes to watch the view count climb. But as the night wore on, something began to shift. New comments started appearing, their tone markedly different from the initial responses. "This is disgusting. How dare you treat an elderly person like that? You should be ashamed of yourself. That man could be someone's grandfather." At first, Jake dismissed these comments as overly sensitive reactions. "Can't take a joke," he muttered, rolling his eyes. But as he continued scrolling, the criticism only intensified. "That's not just an old man, you idiot. Look at his hat. He's a veteran. My grandfather fought in Vietnam. This video makes me sick." Jake's stomach began to churn as he realized the tide was turning against him. He glanced at the view count. It was skyrocketing, but not for the reasons he'd hoped. People were sharing the video in outrage, condemning his actions and calling for accountability. By midnight, Jake's phone was buzzing incessantly with notifications. The video had been picked up by several large social media accounts dedicated to calling out bad behavior online. Suddenly, Jake wasn't just facing criticism from strangers, people he knew were starting to chime in. "Jake, how could you do this? I'm so disappointed," read a message from his English teacher. "Dude, not cool. You went way too far this time," came a text from the captain of his soccer team. As the night stretched into the early hours of the morning, Jake's initial bravado crumbled. He paced his room, running his hands through his hair in frustration. How had this happened? It was just supposed to be a funny prank video. Now people were calling him cruel, ignorant, and disrespectful. Some were even tagging his school in the comments, demanding he face consequences for his actions. When his alarm blared at 7 a.m., Jake hadn't slept a wink. He dragged himself out of bed, dreading what the new day would bring. As he stumbled downstairs, He found his parents sitting at the kitchen table, their faces grim. "Jake," his father began, his voice stern, "we need to talk about this video you posted." Jake's heart sank. He slumped into a chair, bracing himself for the lecture he knew was coming. But as his parents spoke, expressing their disappointment and concern, Jake found himself struggling to defend his actions. For the first time, he began to see the incident through different eyes. "Do you have any idea what that man might have been through?" his mother asked, her voice quivering with emotion. "He could have fought in wars, lost friends in battle, and this is how you treat him?" As Jake walked to school, he felt as if every eye was on him. Whispers followed him down the hallway, and even his friends seemed hesitant to approach him. The weight of what he'd done was finally starting to sink in. During his morning classes, Jake couldn't focus. His phone continued to buzz in his pocket, but he couldn't bear to look at it. At lunch, he sat alone, picking at his food without appetite. It was then that Sarah, the red-headed girl from his friend group, approached his table. "Hey," she said softly, sliding into the seat across from him. "How are you holding up?" Jake shrugged, unable to meet her eyes. "Not great. I really messed up, didn't I?" Sarah nodded, her expression a mix of sympathy and disappointment. "Yeah, you did. But maybe there's a way to make it right." As they talked, Jake began to realize the full impact of his actions. It wasn't just about him anymore. He had hurt someone, disrespected a veteran, and set a terrible example for others. The viral spread of the video meant that his moment of cruelty was now being seen by thousands, perhaps millions of people. That afternoon, as Jake walked home from school, he passed by the park where it had all started. He paused, looking at the bench where Mr. Mason had sat. The old man wasn't there today, and Jake felt a pang of guilt, wondering if his actions had ruined this daily ritual for him. As he stood there, lost in thought, an elderly couple walked by. The woman glared at Jake, whispering loudly to her husband, "That's the boy from the video. Disgraceful." Jake's cheeks burned with shame. He hurried home, his mind racing. He knew he needed to do something, to try and make amends somehow. But what could he possibly do to right this wrong? Little did Jake know, as he grappled with the consequences of his actions, the story was about to take another unexpected turn. The man he had mocked, Mr. Robert Mason, was about to respond to the viral video in a way that would challenge not just Jake, but an entire community's understanding of respect, forgiveness, and the enduring spirit of those who have served their country. In the days following the incident at the park, Robert Mason's quiet life was thrust into an unexpected spotlight. The viral video had spread far beyond the confines of Millbrook, igniting a firestorm of outrage and sympathy. Mr. Mason's neighbors, friends from the local Veterans Association, and even strangers who had seen the video online, reached out to offer their support and encouragement to take action against the disrespectful teenager. At first, Mr. Mason was overwhelmed by the attention. He had never sought recognition for his service, preferring to live a life of quiet dignity. The thought of being at the center of a controversy made him uncomfortable. However, as he reflected on the situation, he saw an opportunity to turn this negative experience into something positive. One evening, as Mr. Mason sat in his modest living room, surrounded by faded photographs of his time in the service and cherished mementos from a life well lived, he made a decision. He would respond, not with anger or a desire for retribution, but with the wisdom and compassion that his years of service and life experience had instilled in him. The next morning, Mr. Mason reached out to Alice Chen, a local journalist he had met at several veterans' events. Alice had always treated the veterans with respect and sensitivity, and Mr. Mason felt she would be the right person to help share his message. When Alice received Mr. Mason's call, she was both surprised and intrigued. She had seen the viral video and had been considering reaching out to Mr. Mason herself. "Mr. Mason," she said warmly, "I'm so glad you called. How are you holding up after everything that's happened?" Mr. Mason's voice was calm as he replied, "I'm doing just fine, Alice. In fact, I was hoping we could talk. I think there's an important message that needs to be shared." Intrigued, Alice agreed to meet Mr. Mason at his home that afternoon. As she set up her recording equipment in his living room, she couldn't help but notice the quiet strength that seemed to emanate from the elderly veteran. Despite the hurtful incident in the park, there was no trace of bitterness in his demeanor. As the interview began, Mr. Mason spoke softly, but with conviction. "I was just a young man myself, not much older than the boy in the park. I saw things there that no one should have to see, and I lost friends, good men who never made it home." He paused, collecting his thoughts before continuing. "But my service didn't end when I came home. I spent years as an instructor, helping prepare young soldiers for the challenges they would face. In a way, I've spent my whole life trying to protect and guide the youth of this country." As Mr. Mason spoke, Alice found herself moved by his words. This was not the angry tirade against disrespectful youth that many might have expected. Instead, Mr. Mason's words were filled with understanding and a deep desire to bridge the gap between generations. "You know, Alice," Mr. Mason continued, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, "when that young man approached me in the park, I saw something familiar in his eyes. It was the same look I've seen in countless young soldiers, a mix of bravado and uncertainty, trying so hard to prove themselves to the world." Alice nodded, encouraging him to continue. Mr. Mason leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant as if looking back through the years. "I've seen much worse than a teenager's taunts in my lifetime. What matters now is not the mistake he made, but how he, and all of us, learn from it." As the interview continued, Mr. Mason shared stories from his time in service, not focusing on the horrors of war, but on the bonds formed between soldiers and the lessons learned about respect, sacrifice, and the value of every human life. He spoke of the importance of understanding history and the sacrifices of previous generations. "You see, Alice," he said, his voice growing passionate, "respect isn't just about honoring veterans or the elderly. It's about recognizing the inherent worth in every person, regardless of their age, background, or circumstances. That young man in the park, he has value too. He has potential. What he needs is guidance, not condemnation." Alice found herself deeply moved by Mr. Mason's words. "Mr. Mason, your response to this situation is incredibly gracious. Many people would be angry or hurt. How do you find it in yourself to be so forgiving?" Mr. Mason's eyes twinkled as he replied, "Well, Alice, when you've lived as long as I have, you learn a thing or two about the power of forgiveness. Holding on to anger only hurts yourself in the end. I'd much rather use this as an opportunity to teach and to learn." As the interview drew to a close, Mr. Mason made a surprising request. "Alice, I'd like to write a letter, not just to the young man, but to everyone who's seen that video. Would you be willing to share it alongside this interview?" Touched by his request, Alice readily agreed. Over the next hour, she watched as Mr. Mason carefully penned his thoughts, his handwriting neat and deliberate. When he finished, he handed the letter to Alice with a gentle smile. The letter read, "To the young man in the park, and to all who have seen the video, I want you to know that I forgive you. We all make mistakes, especially when we're young and trying to find our place in the world. What matters most is not the mistakes we make, but how we learn and grow from them. To everyone else, I ask that you not judge this young man too harshly. Instead, let this be a reminder of the importance of respect, not just for veterans or the elderly, but for all people. We all have something to learn from each other, regardless of age or background. In my years of service and beyond, I've learned that the greatest battles we face are often within ourselves. The battle to choose kindness over cruelty, understanding over judgment, and love over hate. These are the battles I hope we can all fight together. Let's use this moment not to divide us, but to bring us closer as a community and as human beings. Reach out to someone different from you. Listen to their stories. Share your own. In doing so, we honor not just the sacrifices of the past, but the potential of our shared future. With hope and gratitude, Robert Mason." As Alice read the letter, she felt a lump form in her throat. This was more than just a response to a viral video. It was a powerful message of unity and understanding in a world that often seemed increasingly divided. "Mr. Mason," Alice said, her voice thick with emotion, "thank you for sharing this. I believe your words will touch many hearts." Mr. Mason simply nodded, a serene smile on his face. "I hope so, Alice. I truly hope so." The day after Alice Chen's interview with Mr. Mason aired on the local news and was posted online, Millbrook awoke to find itself at the center of a media storm. The story of the disrespectful prank and Mr. Mason's gracious response had captured the nation's attention, spreading across social media platforms and news outlets with breathtaking speed. As people across the country watched the interview and read Mr. Mason's heartfelt letter, a wave of emotion swept through online communities. The narrative that had begun with outrage at a teenager's cruel prank was transformed into a powerful story of forgiveness, wisdom, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Sarah Thompson, the red-haired girl who had stood by Jake during the initial backlash, was one of the first to share the interview on her social media accounts. "This is what true strength looks like," she wrote. "Mr. Mason's words have opened my eyes to what respect really means. We could all learn from him." Learn from Mr. Mason. The hashtag Learn from Mr. Mason quickly gained traction, with people from all walks of life sharing their own stories of forgiveness, respect, and the impact of veterans in their lives. James Rodriguez, a high school history teacher in California, posted a video of himself addressing his class. "Today, we're going to talk about a different kind of heroism," he began. "The kind that Mr. Robert Mason showed us, the heroism of forgiveness and understanding." The video went viral, with educators across the country following suit, using Mr. Mason's story as a teaching moment about respect, empathy, and the long-lasting impact of military service. Veterans organizations seized the opportunity to highlight the ongoing challenges faced by those who have served. The American Legion shared Mr. Mason's interview on their official pages, adding, "Mr. Mason's grace reminds us of the quiet strength carried by so many veterans. Let's honor them not just with words, but with actions. Reach out to a veteran today. Listen to their story. Learn from Mr. Mason." As the day wore on, the story caught the attention of national news networks. Clips from Alice's interview with Mr. Mason were played on repeat, with pundits and commentators praising his measured and compassionate response. In a world that often seems dominated by knee-jerk reactions and cancel culture, Mr. Mason's response is a breath of fresh air, said one news anchor. "He's showing us a different way to handle conflict and disrespect." Celebrities and public figures began to weigh in as well. A popular musician tweeted, "Mr. Mason's words hit hard, made me think about how I treat others, especially those who've sacrificed so much. We all need to do better." Learn from Mr. Mason. Even politicians on both sides of the aisle found common ground in praising Mr. Mason's message. A bipartisan group of senators issued a joint statement commending Mr. Mason for his service and his exemplary response to adversity, calling him a true example of American values at their finest. But perhaps the most profound impacts were felt on a more personal level. All across the country, people were inspired to reach out to the veterans in their lives, to listen to their stories, and to show their appreciation in tangible ways. In a small town in Ohio, a group of teenagers organized a cleanup day at their local veterans' memorial. In New York City, a bustling coffee shop began offering free coffee to veterans, inspired by Mr. Mason's story. A third-grade class in Florida started a pen pal program with a nearby veteran's home, eager to learn from their elders' experiences. Back in Millbrook, the impact was even more pronounced. The local Veterans of Foreign Wars post was inundated with calls from people wanting to volunteer or donate. Mr. Mason, despite his desire to remain out of the spotlight, found his daily walks in the park interrupted by well-wishers thanking him for his service and his message of unity. As the sun set on this extraordinary day, Alice Chen sat at her desk, sifting through the mountain of responses to her interview with Mr. Mason. Her inbox was flooded with messages from people whose lives had been touched by his words. Many shared their own stories of service, of forgiveness, of bridging generational divides. One message, in particular, caught her eye. It was from a young man who identified himself as a recent military recruit. "Mr. Mason's words reminded me why I joined the service," he wrote. "It's not just about defending our country, but about embodying the values that make our country great. Thank you for sharing his story. It's changed how I view my role as a future soldier." Alice leaned back in her chair, a sense of awe washing over her. What had started as a local story about a disrespectful prank had blossomed into a national conversation about respect, forgiveness, and the often overlooked wisdom of our elders. As she began to draft a follow-up piece, Alice couldn't help but wonder about Jake, the young man whose thoughtless actions had set this all in motion. How was he handling the overwhelming response to Mr. Mason's message? Little did she know, Jake's own journey of reflection and redemption was about to take an unexpected turn. In the days following the release of Mr. Mason's interview, Jake Thompson's world had been turned upside down. He had gone from being a typical, carefree teenager to the subject of national scrutiny overnight. The initial shock and defensiveness he had felt had given way to a deep, gnawing sense of shame as he watched Mr. Mason's interview and read his heartfelt letter. Jake sat on the edge of his bed, his room darkened by drawn curtains, scrolling through the seemingly endless stream of comments and reactions to Mr. Mason's words. The outpouring of support for the veteran and the stories shared by people impacted by his message of forgiveness were overwhelming. Jake felt a complex mix of emotions: shame for his actions, awe at Mr. Mason's grace, and a growing sense that he needed to do something to make amends. A soft knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Jake?" His mother's voice called gently. "Can we come in?" Jake mumbled an affirmative, and his parents entered the room. They sat on either side of him, their faces etched with concern and disappointment, but also with love. "Son," his father began, his voice firm but kind, "we need to talk about what's happened and what you're going to do about it." Jake nodded, unable to meet his parents' eyes. "I know, Dad, I really messed up." His mother placed a hand on his shoulder. "Jake, we raised you better than this, but what's done is done. Now it's about how you move forward." For the next hour, Jake and his parents had an open, honest conversation about respect, responsibility, and the impact of one's actions. They showed him articles about veterans struggling with PTSD, about the sacrifices made by military families, and about the importance of treating all people, regardless of age, with dignity. As they talked, Jake felt something shift inside him. The full weight of his actions began to sink in, and with it came a determination to make things right. "I want to apologize," Jake said suddenly, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "Not just to Mr. Mason, but to everyone. I want to do it publicly." His parents exchanged a look of surprise and pride. "Are you sure, Jake?" his father asked. "Once you put yourself out there, you can't take it back." Jake nodded firmly. "I'm sure, Dad. It's the right thing to do." With his parents' support, Jake spent the next few hours drafting his apology. He wrote and rewrote, struggling to find the right words to express his remorse and his newfound understanding. Finally, as the sun began to set, he felt ready. Setting up his camera, Jake took a deep breath and began to record. His usually confident demeanor was replaced by a genuine vulnerability as he looked directly into the camera. "Hi, everyone. I'm Jake Thompson, and I'm the guy from that video with Mr. Mason in the park," he began, his voice slightly shaky. "I'm making this video to apologize to Mr. Mason, to veterans everywhere, and to anyone who was hurt or offended by my actions." Jake paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "What I did was wrong. It was disrespectful, cruel, and completely unacceptable. I was trying to be funny, to get attention online, but I now realize how hurtful and ignorant my actions were." As he spoke, Jake's voice grew stronger, fueled by the sincerity of his words. "Mr. Mason, your response to my prank has taught me more than any lesson I've ever had in school. Your forgiveness and your wisdom have opened my eyes to the true meaning of respect and the sacrifices made by our veterans. Jake went on to address the wider audience he knew would see this video. To everyone who saw my original video, I want you to know that's not who I really am, or at least, not who I want to be. I made a terrible mistake, and I'm committed to learning from it and becoming a better person. He concluded his apology with a pledge. I can't undo what I did, but I can promise to do better. I'm going to start volunteering at our local Veterans Center. I want to listen, to learn, and to find ways to support those who have given so much for our country. I hope that in time, I can earn your forgiveness and show that people can learn and grow from their mistakes. As Jake ended the recording, he felt a mix of exhaustion and relief. He knew this was just the first step on a long journey of making amends, but it felt like an important one. With trembling fingers, he uploaded the video to his social media accounts, the same platforms where he had posted the original prank video. As he hit post, Jake whispered a quiet hope that his words would reach Mr. Mason and that someday he might have the chance to apologize in person. Little did Jake know, his video would soon catch the attention of not just Mr. Mason, but an entire community eager to see how this story of disrespect turned to understanding would unfold. The stage was set for an unexpected reunion that would touch hearts far beyond the boundaries of Millbrook. Jake's apology video spread across social media platforms with the same viral intensity as the original prank video, but this time, the responses were markedly different. While some remained skeptical, many were moved by the teenager's sincerity and his commitment to make amends. Comments ranged from words of encouragement to stories of personal growth and redemption. Among those who viewed the video was Alice Chen, the journalist who had interviewed Mr. Mason. Sensing that this story was far from over, she reached out to Mr. Mason to gauge his reaction to Jake's apology. Mr. Mason, who had been following the unfolding events with quiet interest, surprised Alice with his response. "I'd like to meet him," he said simply. Not for any grand gesture, but just to talk, person to person. Touched by Mr. Mason's continued grace, Alice offered to facilitate the meeting. With the agreement of both parties and Jake's parents, a reunion was arranged at the very park where the initial incident had occurred. The day of the meeting dawned bright and clear, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the old oak trees that dotted the park. Jake arrived early with his parents, his nervousness evident in the way he continually smoothed down his shirt and ran his hand through his hair. "Remember, son," his father said, placing a reassuring hand on Jake's shoulder, "this is about listening and learning, not just apologizing." Jake nodded, his throat too tight with emotion to speak. As they waited, he found himself staring at the bench where it had all begun, the memory of his thoughtless actions playing over in his mind. At precisely 10 a.m., Mr. Mason appeared on the path, walking with measured steps, his familiar cap perched atop his head. Jake's heart raced as the elderly veteran approached, a mixture of shame and hope swirling in his chest. Mr. Mason reached the group, his eyes twinkling with a warmth that immediately put Jake at ease. "Good morning," he said, his voice gentle but strong. "It's good to meet you properly, Jake." Jake swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "Mr. Mason, I'm so sorry," he managed to say, his voice cracking with emotion. Mr. Mason smiled, gesturing to the bench. "Why don't we sit down and talk?" As they settled onto the bench, with Jake's parents and Alice standing a respectful distance away, an almost tangible sense of healing seemed to descend upon the scene. "Jake," Mr. Mason began, "I want you to know that I accept your apology. What you did hurt, I won't deny that, but I've seen the video you made, and I believe you're sincere in your desire to make things right." Jake nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Mr. Mason continued, his voice taking on a tone of gentle wisdom. "You know, when I was about your age, I made plenty of mistakes too. We all do. It's part of growing up. What matters is how we learn from those mistakes." For the next hour, Jake listened intently as Mr. Mason shared stories from his life, his time in the military, the friends he'd lost, the challenges he'd faced upon returning home, and the lessons he'd learned along the way. Jake found himself hanging on every word, seeing for the first time the rich tapestry of experiences that made up this man's life. The thing is, Jake, Mr. Mason said, his eyes distant with memory, respect isn't just about saying, "Thank you for your service," or standing for the national anthem. It's about recognizing the humanity in every person you meet, understanding that everyone has a story, everyone has fought battles you know nothing about. Jake nodded, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. I get that now, Mr. Mason. I really do. I was so caught up in trying to be cool, to get attention online, that I forgot you were a real person with real feelings. Mr. Mason smiled, patting Jake's hand. That's a valuable lesson to learn, son. And you know what? I'm learning from you too. Jake looked up, surprised. From me? But I'm just a kid who made a stupid mistake. But you had the courage to admit that mistake and try to make it right, Mr. Mason replied. That takes real strength of character. You're reminding this old man that it's never too late to learn and grow. As their conversation drew to a close, Jake felt as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He looked at Mr. Mason with newfound respect and admiration. Mr. Mason, he said, his voice steady now, I meant what I said in my video. I want to volunteer, to learn more about veterans and how I can help. Would you be willing to guide me? Mr. Mason's face lit up with a broad smile. I'd be honored, Jake. In fact, why don't you join me at the Veterans Center next week? We can start there. As they stood to leave, Jake impulsively threw his arms around Mr. Mason in a heartfelt hug. The elderly veteran, momentarily surprised, returned the embrace, his eyes misty with emotion. Alice, who had been quietly observing, couldn't help but snap a photo of the touching moment, with permission from both Jake and Mr. Mason. She later shared it online, captioning it simply, "The power of forgiveness and understanding." The image of the teenager and the veteran embracing in the park quickly became a symbol of hope and reconciliation, touching hearts far beyond the boundaries of Millbrook. In the weeks and months that followed Jake and Mr. Mason's emotional reunion in the park, their story continued to resonate across the nation, sparking conversations about respect, intergenerational understanding, and the power of redemption. The photo Alice had taken of their embrace became an iconic image, shared countless times across social media platforms, and featured in news articles about the incident. But more than just a heartwarming story, it became a catalyst for real change. Jake, true to his word, began volunteering at the local Veterans Center. Under Mr. Mason's guidance, he started by helping with simple tasks, serving coffee, assisting with paperwork, or simply sitting and listening to the veterans share their stories. As the weeks passed, Jake's presence became a regular and welcome sight at the center. One afternoon, as Jake was helping to organize a collection of old photographs for a display, he had an idea. "Mr. Mason," he said excitedly, "what if we created a social media campaign to share these stories? We could call it Aksher Veteran Voices or something like that." Mr. Mason's eyes lit up at the suggestion. "That's a wonderful idea, Jake. Let's run it by the center director." With the support of the Veterans Center and the technical know-how of Jake and his friends, the Veteran Voices campaign was launched. Short video interviews with local veterans were posted online, sharing their experiences, wisdom, and the challenges they faced both during and after their service. The campaign quickly gained traction, with veterans and their families from across the country contributing their own stories. What had started as a local initiative soon became a national movement, bridging the gap between generations and fostering a deeper understanding of the veteran experience. Schools began incorporating the Our Veteran Voices videos into their history curricula, providing students with first-hand accounts to complement their textbook learning. The campaign even caught the attention of lawmakers, leading to increased funding for veteran support programs and mental health initiatives. Jake's journey of redemption inspired others as well. Youth organizations around the country started Respect and Reflect programs, encouraging teenagers to connect with elderly members of their communities, particularly veterans, to learn from their experiences and offer support. Mr. Mason, despite his initial reluctance to be in the spotlight, embraced his role as a mentor, not just to Jake, but to many young people who reached out after hearing his story. he began giving talks at local schools about the importance of respect, empathy, and understanding. You see, he would often say, "What happened with Jake and me? It's not just about a veteran and a teenager. It's about how we treat each other as human beings. It's about seeing the person behind the label, whether that label is young, old, veteran, or anything else." The ripple effects of their story continued to spread. Companies began implementing reverse mentoring programs, pairing younger employees with older colleagues to foster mutual learning and respect. Community centers started intergenerational activity groups, bringing together people of all ages to share skills and stories. A year after the incident in the park, Jake stood beside Mr. Mason at a national conference on youth and veteran relations. As they shared their story with the audience, Jake's voice rang with conviction. "A year ago, I made a terrible mistake," he said. "I disrespected not just Mr. Mason, but everything he and his fellow veterans stand for. But through his incredible forgiveness and wisdom, I learned one of the most important lessons of my life, that every person, regardless of age or background, has value, has a story, and deserves our respect." Mr. Mason, his eyes twinkling with pride, added, "And I learned that it's never too late to form new friendships, to learn new things, and to bridge the gaps that sometimes seem to divide us." As they concluded their speech to a standing ovation, Jake and Mr. Mason shared a warm embrace, symbolizing not just their own journey, but the potential for understanding and respect between all generations. Their story, which began with a thoughtless prank in a small-town park, had blossomed into a powerful movement of mutual respect, understanding, and positive change. It served as a reminder to all who heard it that even from our mistakes, something beautiful can grow if we approach each other with open hearts and minds. In Millbrook and beyond, the lesson lived on, that in the end, respect, forgiveness, and the willingness to learn from each other are the true markers of strength, and the foundation of a society where every voice, young or old, is valued and heard.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.